All right. What up, what up, what up? How's it going, everybody? I am here to review yet another video. We are not going to finish the Humor and Emerson video just yet. A new video. Oh, we got Harmonica Luke here. You get 1,000 land salute. So welcome, welcome. So we're not going to finish that video just yet. A new video just came out, so I'm going to review that one first, and we'll see how far we get into this. If you haven't seen, I did a big stream where we responded to quite a few Christian apologists. So there was Jay Dyer and there was Andrew Wilson. I don't know which of them count as Christian apologists or not. And then there were a couple people that were reviewing their discussion with Danny and Parker. And then we had Detroyer and myself and Digital Gnosis and Danny from Phil Talk. We had everybody there. So if you haven't checked that one out, do so, because it was, I don't know, it was very lively, and I think we got a lot accomplished there in terms of clarifying some of the misunderstandings. I will also share this. I just put out a blog post where I went into a bit more detail about that as well. So let me throw that into the chat. And Eric, you get 500 land salute. We will see who else shows up for their 250. Whoop, whoop, whoop. All right. Well, no one's here for the 250 yet, so we'll see when somebody shows up for that. Although I was the third poster, should I give myself the 250? Then it'll go back to me, and then I could just give it out to somebody anyway. Okay, that doesn't make a lot of sense. All right, so here's the video. I'm a little bit into it because a part of it is kind of introductory stuff. So yeah, Eric, that's your first loot. That's great. I hope you're keeping track, because I am not. So I hope anybody that's getting links is keeping track of it. All right, so let's get into the video. Where did the video go? Okay, it's over here. All right. Hope the volume on it is okay. All right, let's do this.
So I decided to ask her a question. I said, I've been reading some books on ethics, and I'm curious about your point of view about something. She said, okay. I said, do you think morality is objective or subjective in some sense?
Now, no, for context, he went to a chiropractor, and he's asking the chiropractor whether they think morality is objective or subjective in some sense. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with posing the question in that way, but keep in mind, if you're asking a person without formal training in philosophy, do you think morality is objective or subjective? For those of you that are familiar with philosophical terminology, that might seem like a clear and straightforward question, but for people without training in philosophy, it's not a clear question. Why do I think that? Well, I did conduct some studies on this, and there's quite a bit of evidence that the way that non-philosophers understand terminology like objective, I use the term relative. I don't think I directly tested for the term subjective. The way that people think about and use this terminology in ordinary language doesn't comport with and clearly pick out a specific usage that philosophers have in mind for that sort of terminology. So, not even philosophers are clear and consistent on this terminology. So take the term subjective. In philosophy, does that refer to the position that moral facts are stance dependent, or does it refer to the fact that moral facts are true relative to the standards of individuals? Or does it refer to the fact that there are certain respects in which certain considerations, judgments, attitudes, or positions depend ontologically on the presence of some kind of mind? This would be something like Searle's ontological. He uses the term. Does he use the term relativism or subjectivism? I think he uses subjectivism. So there's a variety of distinctions that you could potentially draw using that term just within philosophy, and even philosophers are not really all that consistent in their usage of these terms. So if you ask a non-philosopher about whether morality is objective or subjective, I mean, for one, objective and subjective are not mutually exhaustive and are not like a true dichotomy. So that's already not a good way to ask the question, even if you're using philosophical terminology, and even if someone knew that you were. What if you're an narrow theorist? What if you're non-cognitivist? What if you have a view like mine? And if you ask it in the sense of morality being relative to individuals, that's technically orthogonal to the question of whether morality is stance independent. So it doesn't really make sense to say, is morality stance independent, or is it relative? Because those are different distinctions. If it is asking about stance dependence, is it reasonable to expect people without training in philosophy to understand that you're asking something like, do you think that what serves as the truth maker for propositional claims within the moral domain, um, constitutively depends on the standards, attitudes, or values of individuals or groups, or it doesn't do so? Like, that's not the sort of question that would be reasonable to ask a person without training. I lost my train of thought halfway through that sentence, so that didn't make sense. Let me start over. The question would be something like, do you think that what serves as the truth makers of propositional claims within the moral domain constitutively depends on the standards, attitudes, or values, like it's made true by the standards, attitudes, or values of individuals or groups? Or is it instead made true by something other than the standards or values or attitudes of individuals or groups? That is an incredibly sophisticated question to be asking people. And that presumably is the question lurking underneath what he's saying. Now, I already covered how subjectivism people will interpret, there's a variety of different ways philosophers interpret that. How do non-philosophers interpret that? I don't know. I haven't studied that, but it's possible that they interpret it in all sorts of ways that don't comport with philosophical distinctions, usages, and categories. So, if you're asking about a narrow range of technical or semi-technical terminology that are picked out by a term that you're using to a person that doesn't know which, if any, of those the terms you're asking about, and they have a whole host of non-technical colloquial terms, uh, who knows how they're going to respond. And then as far as objective, well, objective can mean judgments that are arrived at without prejudice or bias. That doesn't mean stance independent. It could mean something like absolute, like the exceptionless moral, rules that don't have moral rules that don't have exceptions to them, like you should never lie, something like that. So it could be interpreted as some type of absolutism. It could be interpreted in epistemic terms, like there is some clear and definitive publicly available means of resolving disputes between people. So sometimes people might say, if something's, we have an objective measure of height, we could measure it in centimeters or meters or something like that. Well, the use of meters is socially constructed, although the actual length or distance between things is stance independent. So what exactly do people mean when they say they have an objective measure? It's not entirely clear what non-philosophers mean by that, but at the very least, it seems to have something to do with the kind of shared or public standard by means of which we could evaluate claims in such a way that there couldn't be a legitimate dispute. So it's not like saying a smidge of salt. It's 2 milligrams of salt. Well, I know what that means. You know what that means. It's a kind of publicly available, like commensurability carried on the wings of terminology and shared conceptions about what those terminology refer to. That's not what stance independence is. And yet people use the term objective that way all the time. So when you ask people about this, they interpret it in a variety of different ways. So he's already asking people using two terms that it's very unlikely a person would be disposed to understand what he means. Now, I highlight this not because I think that it was a bad idea from that. This is a fascinating question to ask a person in this context. And, I don't know if I would be courageous enough to ask somebody. So I'm glad that he asked this person. I think it can spark an interesting conversation. But sometimes when you pose questions like that, it might require a bit of a paving of the ground to clarify what you mean by what you're asking. And unfortunately, people, especially philosophers, I don't know what I think he says he has some training in philosophy, but generally speaking, I think philosophers are far too quick to assume that the way that people without training in philosophy think or speak or are disposed to respond to their questions, it's like that it's easy to get them to be in the state of mind and to approach things using the kinds of terminology and to understand the kinds of terminology the way you're using it as intended. And it's not that easy. So that could be quite frustrating. All right. Jack Krell says, hello, Lance. I'm glad that I was able to make it to the stream. By the way, what are your thoughts on the recent scientific paper about being able to observe qualia? Doesn't it further undermine privacy? No, I don't think that further undermines privacy. As much as I would like to say that, I haven't looked at the paper, but it's I did see Sabine. Is it Sabina? I think it's Sabina. I did see her video summarizing what's in the paper. I would have to read the paper to comment on it with any level of not like it's difficult to comment on something if I haven't read it. My guess though is that they're operationalizing the notion of qualia in a way that doesn't comport with the usages that it typically enjoys among academic philosophers. I would bet money on that. And so it probably is the kind of thing like, the Libet experiment supposedly casting doubt on free will. They don't. I do take an empiricist approach, but I think that empirical approaches and scientific findings are often far too quick to think that they can readily resolve philosophical issues. As much as I would love if that were the case, I don't think that it is. So that's probably what's going on with that. Oh, right. Matthias says, how you doing, Lance? I'm doing fine. Oh, wait. And by the way, Jack, I don't know if you noticed, but you were the third person in comments. You get 250 Lance loot as well. Okay, let's keep going with the video. I know I only got like 30, 10 seconds and whatever was going on with it.
She said, what do you mean by morality?
Let me take it back a little just so you could see the setup of the question.
Things up for the chiropractor proper. And so I decided to ask her a question. I said, I've been reading some books on ethics, and I'm curious about your point of view about something. She said, okay. I said, do you think morality is objective or subjective in some sense? She said, what do you mean by morality? Not a good start. I said, okay, what's right? And
I think it's quite a good start. A good start is to clarify what a person's asking you. And you might be surprised when you ask people that don't have a lot of training in moral philosophy about morality, it's not so clear to them what is meant by morality. So I don't know exactly the whole context of what may have been said prior to this, but asking someone what they mean by morality seems like a reasonable question.
What's wrong ethically? She's having a hard time grasping the concept. And so I thought, well, I'll give her a clear case example. And I said, what about murder? Killing a person with no good reason. Is that wrong? Well, I said, well, what? She said, well, I'm thinking. And I'm thinking, what's to think about, right? And finally she said, well, I think it's, it's up to the individual. So I thought, okay, this was not a clear case example. Clear case.
Yeah, and also that response that she gave is not super helpful. What is up to the individual? Like, is it up to individuals to have a stance, whether or not that stance is correct or incorrect? Like, what exactly does it mean for it to be up to the individual? It's not clear what people mean when they say that.
Case examples are supposed to be easy, like who's buried in Grant's tomb? How long was the 100 Years' War? Which actually wasn't 100 years long, as I recall. Or what's the number to 911? Do they still use 911? I don't even know if that's usable anymore. But so this is an easy one. So that wasn't easy enough. So I said, is it okay to torture babies for fun?
No, I think the previous one was too. These are normative moral questions. So standardly, the way that subjectivism would be construed is you would have a moral stance on whether something is right or wrong. So if someone asks you, imagine someone asks you, hey, do you think that, the taste of food, whether it's tasty or not, is objective or subjective? And you go, I don't know. And they're like, oh, well, let me give you an example. Do you think that pineapple on pizza tastes good? Well, if you say yes, does that mean that you think that the taste of whether it's good or bad on pizza is like objective? No, because that's the same thing you would say if you think it's subjective. So asking a first order question as if it were diagnostic of a person's second order stance doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So these are not good questions to ask. I don't know why he posed these questions. So if you ask, a subjectivist, hey, do you think, torturing babies or murder or whatever is wrong? Like a philosopher that's a subjectivist that disapproves of those things would just say, yes, I think those are wrong. So, subjectivism is not the view that nothing is wrong. So why would this be a difficult question for somebody? So, I don't know what this person was thinking, but if someone starts hitting you with like questions in this context, you might think that they're trick questions. You might think there's more to them than they appear to have going on for them. Who knows what this person was thinking?
Well, and then she says this, I wouldn't want anyone to do that to my baby. Now, I want you to think about the response. Of course, anybody would say that. I wouldn't want them to do that to my baby. But I wasn't asking her about what she would personally desire. I was asking whether the action itself was wrong, regardless of whether anybody wanted anyone else to do that to anyone.
So why not say that? Why not ask that then? If you're hitting someone with technical terminology and you're not explaining it, what do you expect? And I don't know if he went on to explain this to this person. But one thing this might indicate is that people are naturally disposed to think of moral considerations in terms of what they want. I mean, at least this person is. So it is interesting when people claim to be, well, not claim. I mean, they are. That when people are so confident that most people are moral realists or latent moral realists, and then you get an anecdote that is at least one person that doesn't seem to respond in the way you would expect if people are intuitively disposed towards moral realism. Jeff Nason, I use pineapple on pizza a lot as an example. Says it's objective that pineapple on pizza is morally reprehensible. I don't know why people don't like pineapple on pizza. I love sweet savory combos, like chocolate covered pretzels, that kind of thing. They're nice. There's a lot of food that I think benefits from sour and sweet flavors mixed with savory. So I don't know. I think people that don't like it are incorrect and they're missing out.
Long pause. Finally, she said, I think people should be allowed to decide for themselves. Now, this is not the first time that I've...
By the way, people should be allowed to decide for themselves. It's unclear whether that's a metaethical position. It sounds like a normative position. And it sounds like a position where you have a position of something like, look, people have a right to or are entitled to hold different moral stances than I have, something like that. That doesn't sound like a metaethical position. So it doesn't look like the person was understanding the question that he asked.
Asked the question about torturing babies for fun, and I've gotten an equivocal response. I was on KFI in Los Angeles once, the big secular talk jock station that goes all the way to actually at night it'll go all the way to the Mississippi River. It's that powerful. And I was interviewed there, and I got the same response from the host. What's going on here? And that idea we touched on a little bit yesterday, it's called relativism. But today I want to talk about it with regard specifically to the area of morality.
So the idea is relativism. Let's see if we're going to get a good description of what relativism is supposed to be. So if you recall, relativism is used in a variety of ways. It could be used to refer to a metaethical position. It could also be used to refer to the descriptive claim that there's variation in the moral standards of individuals or groups. It'd be like an empirical observation about human psychology or something. And it could be used as this normative claim that you ought to tolerate people with different moral standards than you, or cultures with different moral standards than you. And this could be cashed out in a variety of ways. Maybe you shouldn't try to impose your values on them. You shouldn't judge them. You shouldn't condemn them, that sort of thing. You shouldn't, hold them subject to the legal standards of your culture or just you as an individual. So there are a variety of ways you could cash it out, but it's like a normative position and how you should treat other people. So, that's a normative position. It's not metaethics. Descriptive relativism is an empirical descriptive claim. It's not metaethics. The one that's metaethical is the one that says, hey, moral claims are best understood as expressing propositions that have an implicit indexical component that allows the truth status of the claim to vary in accord with the standards of the speaker or the culture of the speaker, something like that. So maybe there's a couple other ways you might want to construe different subcategories of relativism, metaethical relativism. Often, and this is something I talked with Derek McAllister about, you'll run into people that say they're relativists like in the wild. And what they endorse seems to be some muddled mishmash of all three of these and possibly other positions as well. Or, it could be two of these, it could be all three of these, it could be just one of these. It's hard to say. So there is this kind of folk relativist that appears to have muddled, confused, and confusing views about the nature of morality. And at least some of them would call themselves relativists, and they'll seem to have relativist-ish views. Problem is that there's a distinction between the muddled and confused views of people on the street, it's folk relativism, and metaethical relativism. They're different views. And often what you'll find is that people will give descriptions or accounts of running into folk relativists who are espousing some kind of folk relativist view. And then when they start critiquing it, it looks like they're critiquing something like metaethical relativism, even though metaethical relativism is not the mishmashy hodgepodge of folk relativism. And that can be very frustrating because one of my goals is to defend meta-ethical positions. I'm not trying to defend folk relativism. I think it's a mess. I think it's a goofy idea, to the extent that it even is any distinctive idea. So I'm not defending that, but meta-ethical relativism, especially of the appraiser form, is typically not subject to many of the criticisms that critics level at it. It's just not subject to them. So we'll see where he takes this.
Now, I talked yesterday, and we'll just do a little review, about the difference between relativism or subjectivism, or what I called ice cream kind of truth. Remember that? I think a bunch of people went on.
Take a look at that.
About the difference between relativism or subjectivism.
Relativism or subjectivism. The way he's using the terminology, it kind of sounds like he's using them interchangeably. I do this sometimes myself. It's still not clear what he means by these views, but the kind of is possibly somewhat pejorative but slightly silly label, ice cream relativism, actually I think it's quite accurate. I think it's quite apt. I do think it could mislead people, because people will mistakenly think that if you think morality is like ice cream metanormatively, that you're also comparing it in terms of universality and scope. But over many times how that's not the case. And so we may get, whatever, I'll just get to it now. If I say, my moral claims are true in the same way that my ice cream preferences are true, what I mean is that they're made true by my preferences. What I'm not saying is that they are of equal importance, that I'm equally compromising about them, that I'm equally disposed to change my mind on them, that they're equally applicable to only myself. So for instance, my preference for ice cream is a preference about what I do. My preference for no murder is a preference about what everybody does. I don't want anybody to murder. And there's no contradiction in there, and there's no problem in there. If you're I'm not a moral relativist technically, but there's no contradiction or problem for saying, hey, one of my normative attitudes concerns my own conduct, and another normative attitude I have concerns everybody's conduct. That has nothing to do with realism or anti-realism. Is completely consistent with subjectivism. And so what will sometimes happen is if someone says, oh, well, you think morality is subjective, it's just like your ice cream preferences, therefore, it doesn't make sense to hold other people accountable to your moral standards. That doesn't follow, because the sense in which moral claims being subjective and ice cream preferences being subjective is in the sense of what it is that makes them true, what serves as truth makers. Now, I think I saw Greg in another discussion where he talked about the truth. He used the truth maker terminology. So I think he is quite familiar with some of these distinctions. We'll see how he does in this video. I can't recall exactly how well he does. I think I had some critical things to say, but I think overall, I was actually quite impressed with some of the remarks that he made. I think he does quite a bit better of a job than a lot of the people that I've seen on here. And that might be because of a background in philosophy. So I will be critical, but I also think that I've seen people that really don't seem to know what they're talking about. I think I have some quibbles here, but I think he understands this topic better than most of the people that you'll see speaking about it that I tend to critique. With the exception of academic philosophers that work on the topic for a living, they tend to make far, far, far fewer mistakes. So in any case, that's what's frustrating about this, that people will think if you compare morality being subjective to food preferences, that you're comparing it in other respects. Now, I've started calling this the over-comparison fallacy. And this would be like if I said, hey, the lemon, the sun is similar to lemons because both are yellow. Now, I don't know if that's technically true. I've heard people say that the sun is actually white and it looks yellow from scattering in the atmosphere or something, whatever. Never mind that. Assume that the sun is actually yellow. Now, if you compare the sun to a lemon and say they're both yellow, the way that the over-comparison fallacy would work would be for someone to go, you can't compare the sun and a lemon because the sun is much bigger than a lemon. The sun is really hot and lemons are not. The sun, produces lots of radiation and lemons do not. There are lots of differences between them. You can't compare the two things. This is complete nonsense, and it's silly when people do this. This has nothing to do with the video, by the way. This is just a general point I want to make about this sort of thing. Maybe he does an over-comparison fallacy, but I don't recall. I'm just describing it in general. The problem here is someone thinking that when you compare things with respect to one characteristic or dimension, that you're comparing them with respect to other characteristics or dimensions, or you're saying something like they're generally pretty similar. And that's not what you're saying when you compare two things. If I say lemons and the sun are both yellow, I'm saying absolutely nothing about whether they're similar or different in any other respects. And, it's very unfortunate for people to take, I'm comparing X to Y to mean X is generally like Y. Like if I said, oh, my friend Joe, he's like your friend Alex, right? That would be saying they're similar in a lot of respects. There's lots of like points of connection. But if I just said, "Hey, I have a friend named Greg, and you have a friend named Greg," it doesn't follow that they're alike in any other respect other than the fact that they have the name Greg. It's just nothing else follows. And so, for whatever reason, people will make this mistake of criticizing relativism.
Or what I called ice cream kind of truth. Remember that? I think a bunch of people went out and had ice cream for dessert last night because I, fired up all those carnal desires. And insulin kind of truth. So an ice cream kind of truth is something that is true for the individual. Okay, true for me. And ice cream kinds of truths are neither right nor wrong. And what I mean.
Couple things there. So, one, they're right for the individual. It's unclear what that means. So if you're a subjectivist, there's a big difference between, again, it's not clear whether by subjectivist he means a stance-dependent cognitivist or he means a relativist to the level of the individual. But if he means a relative, actually, it wouldn't really matter. On either of these accounts, the same thing would be true. In both cases, you could have a view about the scope of the moral standards. Stance dependence and individual relativism are both consistent with having moral attitudes or preferences about how other people conduct themselves. So when you say true for the individual, that could be true like relative to the standards of that individual without that being saying anything about who the moral standards apply to. You're just saying it's like correct or incorrect according to, say, Lance's standards. And then like one of my standards could be nobody should steal. Or it could be that you're saying that whatever the content of the normative rules the person endorses are only applicable to themselves. Given the comparison to ice cream, it sounds like that might be what he has in mind. If that's the case, that would be a mistake. But unfortunately, he doesn't clarify here. At least he hasn't clarified yet. So it's not clear what he means by true for the individual. But notice the other thing he says. Let me take it back.
Kind of truth. So an ice cream kind of truth is something that is true for the individual.
Unclear what that means. It could mean a number of things. It could be a claim about the scope of the normative standard, whether it's only applicable to oneself or not, or it could be a claim about who the claim is made true relative to. But it also doesn't disambiguate appraiser and agent forms of individual relative. If that's the kind of subjectivism he has in mind. But again, it's not clear. So we're not clear on whether this has to do with stance dependence or indexicalization. We're not clear on whether there's appraiser or agent relativism. We're not clear on whether he's referencing scope or he's not referencing scope. And this is something that I cannot stress enough. That do you see how, if you peel back the layers here, we're dealing with really quite an array of technical concepts. And the way that people talk about them in many, many contexts simply isn't up to the task of disentangling the nuances and the distinctions that are actually critically relevant to evaluating the legitimacy of these views. Whatever criticisms you're going to level is really going to depend on what type of subjectivism you're talking about. And if we're not clear on it, it's unclear whether the criticisms land. And it can lead to a person inadvertently equivocating or making all sorts of mistakes. So it's very frustrating to listen to this sort of thing because people just don't get the distinctions clear. They don't cash out what they mean. And, this isn't even an especially bad example of this. What I'm pointing out is even when someone is actually being kind of careful to explain what they mean, they still just don't disambiguate enough. And that's, to me, I just find that really, really frustrating. Now, why don't people disambiguate enough? One is they may just not be aware of the disambiguations. Two is they may not care. They may not think they're very important. But three, I think that the kinds of conceptual categories and distinctions that I'm talking about are not natural or native to the way that people tend to think. And so it's not so obvious to them that it's important to get it right. To me, a lot of this would sound like if someone was saying, yeah, strawberries, that vegetable that's a mammal. Like, what do you mean by that? Like, so sometimes the claims are inaccurate. If by vegetable, do you just mean plant, or do you mean like the culinary category? If by, like, someone might use the term mammal, and really it would be better to say living thing. So, or maybe I could have said animal or something like that. So it's often what you see is people that use terminology in ways that they might be accurate if you disambiguate it properly, or they look slightly off, but you see where they're coming from. but that's only because I'm so familiar with listening to now, hundreds of people talk about this stuff. But for a person without training in philosophy, it's hopeless. So I don't know what audience he's talking to, but it might be quite challenging for them to follow much of the content of what he's discussing here and to really grasp what he's getting at. And again, not because he's doing a bad job. It looks like he's probably quite a bit better of an orator than I am, for sure. But he's dealing with a topic that might just be too complicated for a lay audience, at least a lay audience that you could expect to understand what you're saying if you don't really take the time. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you might need to present it over the course of several lectures, give quizzes, exams. This is not easy stuff to deal with, and it's a little frustrating for people to underestimate the difficulties of understanding meta-ethical concepts and distinctions.
Okay, true for me. And ice cream kinds of truths are neither right nor wrong. And what I mean is they're neither correct.
Well, notice that ice cream kinds of truths are neither correct nor incorrect. That's just not true. Standard forms of subjectivism are going to be cognitivist positions. They're positions that think that treat moral claims as being truth apt, that is capable of being true. They're not error theory, so they don't hold that they all end up being false. They do think that there are moral truths. So they think that things are capable of being right, and they think that things are capable of being wrong relative to the standards of individuals or according to a potential stance. Could be one stance, because they could be some kind of relation designating account, like ideal observer theory. So, again, we can't disambiguate because it doesn't look like he's going to clarify what exactly he's referring to, whether it's stance dependence or indexicalization. But again, on either construal, it's not true that if you're a subjectivist that you think that things can't be right or wrong. It's just not true. For the comparison, if you're a subjectivist about food preferences, does that mean you think it's not possible for food to be good or bad? No, that doesn't make any sense. If you think music is a matter of taste, like, some people like Metallica, some people don't. Does that mean it's not true that music is good or bad? Of course not. It means that music is good or bad relative to people's individual preferences. So this idea that people slide between describing some type of subjectivism or relativism and saying that it doesn't allow for things to be right or wrong, it's just not true. And it's quite frustrating to see someone make that kind of error. And this is what I'm talking about, where I think overall his delivery, his style of presentation, much of the content here is quite good. And yet you still see mistakes like this.
Nor incorrect is what I mean. All right. Then when it comes to insolent kind of truths, these are truths pertaining to not something inside the person, their own feelings and desires and tastes and mere convictions, but something that is true in virtue of something outside of the person. Okay, like some kind of disease that requires a particular kind of medicine, whether you agree or believe in it or not. So that's insolent kind of truth. So this inside-outside distinction is maybe the easiest way to distinguish between subjective truth and objective truth.
So it sounds like he's using subjective to mean stance dependent, which technically isn't a type of relativism. Like some subjective positions will be relativistic and some won't. Now, there's a very minor quibble, which is he's just saying outside of yourself, but there are things outside of yourself that could also be stances. So there could be an ideal observer. What if all moral truths are determined by a council of elders and you're not part of the council? Well, moral truth isn't determined by your stances, but it is determined by other people's stances. And so that's still a type of anti-realism. So it's not enough to give you subjectivism to say that the moral facts are not made true by yourself, because what if they're made true by your culture or your species or a council of elders or an ideal observer or ChatGPT? It decides it's morally right or wrong. Well, then they're still all being made true relative to a stance. You could quibble about whether ChatGPT has a stance. But in all of those cases, you still have a type of anti-realism. You still have, depending on the way you're using the terminology, a type of subjectivism. So outside yourself is not clear enough. It has to be outside yourself and the stances of anybody else. So little quibble, but still worth making.
Subjective truth is often called relativism. Okay.
Now, he's not wrong that it's often called relativism, but technically, technically you can use the terms interchangeably, and then other times people don't. Unfortunately, people use both terms to refer to different distinctions and the same distinction. So subjectivism can be interchangeable with relativism or not. Relativism, subjectivism can be used. How do I put this? People use the term subjectivism to refer to different concepts, and they use different terms to refer to the same concepts. And so you don't really have a whole lot of consistency. And this is true even in the academic literature. So sometimes it's used interchangeably, sometimes it's not. So not really something to quibble with them about. This is one terminological profile you could go with, but there are others. People would sometimes not use the terms interchangeably.
That is, the truth is relative to the individual, all right? If you want a little more philosophical, hoity-toity way of thinking of it, relativistic truth is mind-dependent.
Great. So now he's using some of the technical terminology here. And he's specifying that he means mind-dependent. Again, though, it takes several minutes for him to get to this, and so he disambiguates at a certain point. But note that when he was asking this person, the chiropractor, it's not clear if he disambiguated the terminology to them. So on one level, what's nice about this is he's aware of the technical terminology. So far, he's using it quite accurately. Unfortunately, when I say that a lot of this terminology is used in inconsistent ways, I'm not blaming him for that. This is like blame philosophers, go yell at them. It's not his fault that people use it in inconsistent ways. And so as he's cashing it out, he's in some cases saying, yeah, we could just use a couple of these terms interchangeably. And then he's cashing out some other technical terms you could use to try to explain what these terms mean. Mind dependent is becoming a little bit of an outdated term as people shift over to stance dependent, stance independent. Nothing fundamentally wrong with it, though. I tend to use them interchangeably. It's not that big of a deal.
And objective truth is mind independent. So when it comes to morality, that which is ethically right or wrong, okay? Relativism says that morality is just a matter of individual choice, belief, preference. It's an ice cream kind of thing. And so if you have one understanding what's right or wrong on a particular issue, famously abortion or premarital sex or other kinds of sexual variations, well, that's your view. You're welcome to your view. Actually, that's changed quite a bit now. It used to be you're welcome to your view, I got my view. Now it's not, you're no longer welcome to your own view anymore. Now the cultural pressures are you have to adopt our view. So truly it's one group forcing their morality on others. If you don't adopt it, you have to at least act like you adopt it. But that's a little bit of a separate issue. Let's not overcomplicate things. In relativistic morality, if you think it's okay to have premarital sex, that's true or right for you. And if
So it's true. It's all right for you. It sounds like some type of agent relativism.
someone doesn't, then it's true or right for them. And they're on, in a certain sense, separate islands of morality. Different people have their own moral points of view, and that's all you can say about it. And by the way, the space between those islands of morality is called tolerance. So we let the other person...
No, he brings tolerance into this. Now, tolerance may be a more naturally accompany agent relativism, but it does not accompany appraiser relativism. So, we would need to get clear on whether he's talking about agent or appraiser relativism, but it certainly sounds like agent relativism.
Have their view, and we don't bug them about that, and we have our view. And this is why people will say, with regards to morality, who are you to tell me, or why are you pushing your morality on me? This kind of language is reflecting an internal sense, or at least an awareness, or at least what turns out to be a fairly shallow conviction, that morality is not the kind of thing that applies to other people.
Notice he says, turns out to be a fairly shallow conviction. That's a psychological question. He's not in a position to know how shallow the conviction is. And this is something that's quite frustrating. You'll see with Christian apologists and even sometimes philosophers, is they think that people are these kind of, fair weather relativists that will fold under pressure. And I've seen no indication that that's true.
Is an internal sense, or at least an awareness, or at least what turns out to be a fairly shallow conviction, that morality is not the kind of thing that applies to other people, it's just individual.
Now, not the kind of thing that applies to other individuals. So, not the kind of thing that applies to other people, only the individual. So here he's talking about agent relativism. We've been over the agent and appraiser relativism distinction. So agent relativism holds that what's morally right or wrong is determined by the standards of individuals or groups, and it's applicable to those individuals or groups. So kind of individuals or groups fix the moral standards for those individuals or groups, and they don't fix the standards for other individuals or groups. Those individuals or groups do. And you kind of have an obligation in some sense to respect or acknowledge that if someone else or some group thinks some practice they engage in is morally correct, it is morally correct for them to engage in it. It's perfectly fine. That is a type of relativism, but there's another type of relativism, appraiser relativism. And this looks at the status of moral claims as them being true or false relative to the standards of whoever is evaluating the claim. So take some claim murder is wrong. Well, people don't, murder is not good because often it's just like defined as like wrongful killing, at least in online debate circles. So stealing is wrong. So I think stealing is bad. Let's say there's somebody else that thinks it's good. When I say stealing is bad, it's true. When they say stealing is bad, it's false. This says nothing about, I don't have to think that if they think stealing is okay, that it is okay for them to steal. I judge myself and everybody else by my moral standards. They judge themselves and everybody else by their moral standards. And neither of us are obliged to honor, respect, or tolerate the moral standards of others. So this is appraiser relativism. It does not have the problems that agent relativism has, at least some of them. And yet, for whatever reason, people characterize relativism as if it's only agent relativism and not appraiser relativism. I find that very strange.
I think human beings deeply down are common sense moral realists, and I'll talk.
Look at that. People deep down are common sense moral realists. This is an empirical claim. There is no compelling empirical evidence that this is true. None. So, if you haven't seen me talk about this before, I have a background not just in philosophy, but in psychology. In fact, my PhD is in psychology. And I wrote my dissertation on the psychology of metaethics, in particular, how non-philosophers think about moral realism and anti-realism. So I'm a specialist in the empirical literature on whether or not it's true that people without training in philosophy are deep down common sense moral realists. I think the answer is no, they're not. Now, that doesn't mean I think that they're deep down moral relativists or subjectivists. I think that they don't have anything deep down regarding metaethics for much the same reason they don't have anything deep down regarding mathematical Platonism or quantum mechanics or a variety of other technical, abstract, philosophical, and scientific matters for which ordinary language has very little, I think Michael Gill puts it this way, very little purchase. It's just not in the business of addressing these sorts of questions. They're not required, like taking a position on these issues is not required to do what people do with moral language or causal language or mathematical language. So they just don't have stances in this at all. So this is called folk metaethical indeterminacy. This is what I defend in my paper. And I point to a host of empirical evidence gathered by others and myself, which suggests that non-philosophers simply don't understand questions about metaethics when they're asked to them, unless they have training to do so. Now, this isn't because ordinary people are like incompetent or anything like that. It's much the same way, if you went up to somebody, an expert mathematician genius in the 1600s and started throwing quantum mechanics terminology at them, they're just not going to know what you're talking about. Now, could they learn? Absolutely. Learn better than I would. But you can't just hit people with technical terms and expect, or terms that have distinctive proprietary uses that might map onto some use that you would be familiar with, but you don't disambiguate. Just expect the person to know what you're asking. That's not how language works. You need a context of shared usage where a person can readily pick up on what you're trying to say to understand you. And when you throw philosophical questions at people that are not prepared for them, they don't have the appropriate context. They don't know what you're talking about. They don't know how your terms discriminate between one consideration and another. They don't have any reliable way to respond. So this is not the fault of non-philosophers at all. And it says nothing about their competence or their ability to reason, and everything to do with the lack of care and precision that researchers have taken in being sensitive to the fact that you can't just expect people to understand complicated philosophical questions without training. That's just not how human thinking works, unless you are super duper confident that they're like people have implicit philosophical views. When did we prove that? The answer is never. So for whatever reason, philosophers operate on the presumption that ordinary language is like underwritten by implicit commitments to various philosophical theses, and they've never provided any evidence this is true. They just seem to assume that this is true, and I think it's not true. And so what I argue is that the best interpretation of the available evidence is that people probably just don't have views about these issues, and that's why they're not being responsive to these questions in the way that researchers intend. You can't get someone to interpret your question as you intend if they don't know what the hell you're talking about. And again, it's not their fault. So um, I don't think this is an easily circumvented problem. I don't think it's going to be easy for people to actually figure out how non-philosophers think about this, but you'll just see people say people are common sense realists. And, when they do that, ask them, what's the evidence for this? This is an empirical claim. It's not a claim that we could figure out by just sitting down and thinking about it. And people just don't present the evidence. They seem perfectly content to just make sweeping claims about human psychology without any psychological data. It's very frustrating. Jeff says, are God's moral judgments mind dependent? It's going to depend on whatever theological or philosophical views you take. For most theists, the answer is probably no, but for some they might be. And then there'd be some kind of anti-realist theist. It's not a whole lot of those, though. Yeah, so Sapir says, I'm pretty sure that some apologists consider that metaphysical claim and use written in your heart language from the Bible to support that. But quite, like I know the passage, when I ask people if there's evidence in the Bible for moral, like that God endorses moral realism, or that realism is true, they often cite that, the law of God is written in your heart and stuff. Nothing to do with meta-ethics, nothing to do with moral realism. I don't know why people think that's some kind of evidence of moral realism. It is not.
Talk about that more at the end, but let's just take this at face value. This is what we're confronting. Moral relativism. Now, moral objectivism is just on the other side, okay? Objectivism is the view that morality is not just something you feel and it's up to the individual, but there is an objective state of affairs. There is an objective morality that hangs over everybody. And it's true whether somebody believes it or not. This is what we talked about last night. I talked about abortion. Is that an insulin, or abortion is wrong? Is that insulin or ice cream? Well, that's a claim about the real world, whether in fact abortion is right or wrong. It's an insulin kind of claim. There may be disagreements about whether that's an accurate statement or not, but it's an insulin kind of claim. I'm saying that because I'm an objectivist. Moral relativists, they're not going to say that's an insulin kind of claim. They're going to say it's an ice cream kind of claim, along with all the sexual issues and a whole bunch of other things, by the way. So I'm just now making the distinctions here between moral relativism, moral subjectivism, and moral objectivism. All right. And just to offer a clarification, because there's a lot of confusion about this. I'm sympathetic to confusion on this issue. And I think there's confusion because there's so much rhetorical stuff going on in the air to confuse people, and there's a lot of cultural pressure to push you in a certain direction in your understanding of these things. So I want to make another distinction here before I move on with a critique, all right? And the other distinction is, I've already made the point that subjectivism or moral relativism is mind-dependent and objectivism is mind-independent. Okay, what this means is that every truth claim is always dependent on the circumstances, okay?
Oof. That's another mistake. Ugh, this is frustrating. So, there is a difference between this. Whether or not a moral claim, like stealing is wrong, is true or false, depends on whether I'm making the claim or you're making the claim. Because it could be made true by my standards or your standards, or it could be made true by the standards of my culture or your culture. We could be from different cultures. So that is what you would be getting at if you're talking about some type of stance-dependent relativism, where moral claims are true or false in a way that's indexed to the standards of different individuals or groups, and it's specifically indexed to their stances. That gives you a type of anti-realist relativism. There's a difference between that and then whether an action in a category like stealing or killing or deception or whatever, whether the content of the various actions in that category, whether all members of the set are true, all members of the set are false, or some members of the set. And by set, I mean like all potential instances of stealing, all potential instances of killing, all potential instances of lying. So just think of the hypothetical set of all possible cases of lying. Or would we assign a wrong to every single member of the set? Would we assign a right or a permissible to every member of the set? Or would we say wrong in some cases, right or permissible in other cases? The answer for most people would probably be the third one of those. There's cases where it's wrong to lie. There's cases where it's acceptable to lie. There's cases where it's mandatory to lie. The classic case being, the troops show up at your house, they're looking for the group they want to genocide, you're hiding under your floorboards, and you say, I'm not going to tell you where they are. In that case, you're obligated to lie. At least I think so. I don't think it's just a nice thing to do. I think you should tell those people to fuck right off and lie through your teeth. So, when you're looking at these sorts of cases, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm getting real tired. I got up very early for complicated reasons. Okay, so I gotta get the juices flowing in my brain again. I shouldn't do this so late. Right. Okay. So in those cases, note how in the latter case, so it's like all members of the set lying. Are they all right? Are they all wrong? Or are they sensitive to context? That has nothing to do with whether the set of instances of lying are all right, all wrong, all permissible, or it's variable. That's consistent with what's in that set, the assignment of right, wrong, good, bad, permissible, impermissible, being made true relative to the standards of individuals or groups, or it being true according to a single stance-independent moral standard, or it being, in fact, it could vary according to a bunch of different stance-independent moral standards, because actually relativism is consistent with realism. So it's consistent with any of these positions. Sensitivity to context is not relevant to the meta-ethical distinctions here. So when he says context, just an error. That's not what relativism or subjectivism are about. They're not about whether an action being right or wrong depends on context.
So let me ask you this. Is it true? This is not a trick question, so it's easy to answer. I'm just letting you know in advance. Is it true that Greg Koukl is speaking in front of you right now? Yes. Okay. Will that be true in an hour and a half? No. Why won't that statement be true in an hour and a half? Because the circumstance changes. Truth is when your claim matches the circumstance. When the circumstance changes, then the truth claim has to change with the circumstance. You with me on that? Okay, now this is how it applies to morality, and this is where lots of people get really confused. And this is unfortunate, the way sometimes people have defined objective truth, which they sometimes call absolute truth, and I think that confuses matters.
I agree with him. That does confuse matters. They do sometimes call it absolute truth. I've even seen it in published papers. So it does confuse matters. Yeah, so Piers says, one moment. He says, weird for someone that is adding to the confusion to bring up concerns about all the confusion. Well, I think he's doing his best to try to clear up some of the confusion, but I think he is adding to it. Jeremy says, it's an empirical claim too. Where's the evidence that social pressure to advocate moral subjectivism is stronger than pressure for objectivism? True. I know of no particularly strong social pressure for that. Maybe we have an argument from meta-ethical convergence. People are converging on relativism, and that's evidence of relativism. I like that correspondence is surrounded by ghosts. I think that whenever people talk about correspondence of truth, correspondence theories of truth, that they should be required to put ghost emojis around it. They should do that for dualism and moral realism and other sorts of terms, put ghost emojis around them. I'm not being serious, by the way. Don't get all upset.
All right. And what they'll say is truth is something that's true for all people at all times and all places.
True for all people at all times and all places. All people, all times, all places. Well, that sounds like some kind of universalism. So that's not objectivism or absolutism in the sense of it being used interchangeably with objectivism. Absolutism is sometimes used to refer to exceptionless moral rules, which also isn't what this is. So, again, not his fault, but unfortunately, there's just absolutely no consistency in the terminology. It's so ridiculous that we're having to sit here. I mean, we're 12 minutes into this, and he spent 9 of these minutes just trying to explain the terminology. Philosophers, come on, y'all gotta get it together. Philosophers have generated such inconsistent use of words. It's hard for people to even figure out what the hell they're talking about because they just won't use the same terms for the same concepts. It's so annoying. Philosophers get together and agree to use terms consistently, whether it's not your favorite term or not. Maybe we have to drop stance independence as a term. I don't care. The benefits of consistency would be just marvelously useful. The fact that philosophers haven't done this, I think, is an indictment of philosophers as a community. It's a bad thing for them to not do this. They're undermining progress within their field. They're making the field less accessible to outsiders. They're making everything more annoying and difficult and challenging and frustrating to no good end. So they should get over it.
But we just said that it's true that Greg Koukl is speaking right now, but it will not be true at all times. It won't be true in an hour and a half because the circumstances change. You're with me on that so far, right? There's very obvious application, but it has the same application is in play regarding morality. When the circumstances change, sometimes the moral truth regarding those circumstances change. I'll give you a very good example. Is it wrong to punch somebody in the face? And some of you are likely to respond, yes, that's naughty, Wait a minute, doesn't it depend? If I walked up to you and just punched you in the face right now, that probably wouldn't be very nice. But what if I was trying to defend you from hurting a child and I punch you in?
Yeah, so now he's giving concrete examples that just really drive home how he's just mixing things up here. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. The set of instances in which you punch a person in the face. Punching a person in the face for fun, morally wrong. Punching a person in the face to stop them from hurting a child, morally right. Might even be morally mandatory. This has absolutely nothing to do with meta-ethics. It has nothing to do with objectivism or relativism or subjectivism. It has nothing to do with this. It could be objectively true that you ought to punch people to stop them from hurting kids, but you ought not, or you're prohibited from punching people for fun. And it could also be true relative to the standards of individuals or groups. This distinction just has nothing to do with meta-ethics. So what is he talking about? How did he end up making this mistake? It's real frustrating. If you're going to talk about this stuff, don't make a bunch of basic mistakes. But it's just like video after video after video. When I review this, people they can't get things in order. And what's so frustrating about this is that he's actively seeking to clarify and disambiguate to what seems from the way he's explaining things like a lay audience, and he's actually adding to the mistakes and the confusions.
In the face. Would that be wrong then? Probably not. That would be different, wouldn't it? Why is it different? Why is it in some cases it's wrong to punch somebody in the face, but in other cases it's okay to? Because the circumstances change. So moral truth is always dependent on the circumstances, just like any other truth claim. Here's the problem. When I teach this and say this, and this is standard ethical thinking. By the way, this is why you have things like moral dilemmas. And why you have to work through. What's the right thing to do in this circumstance? But when I talk like this, I have been actually called a moral relativist. There's a kind of a fairly well-known.
Great. So it looks like he's saying this is not relativism, but let's go back and look at what he was saying before, because it sounded like he was saying it was.
And just punch you in the face. Right? There's that it's true that Greg Koukl is speaking of truth, and I think changes, then the truth claim has to be true in an hour and a half. Okay, so let me ask you this, is that every truth claim is always dependent on the circumstances with a critique, all right? And the other distinction is, I've already made the point that subjectivism or moral relativism is mind-dependent and objectivism is mind-independent, okay? What this means is that every truth claim is always dependent on the circumstances, okay? So let me ask you this.
I might have made a mistake here. I think I interpreted him as saying, as like giving a definition or characterization of subjectivism. Let's have a look at that. I think I might have made a mistake here. Although it's a mistake that is partially due to lack of clarity on his part.
I've already made the point that subjectivism or moral relativism is mind-dependent and objectivism is mind-independent. Okay.
Okay. One's mind-dependent, the other's mind-independent.
Okay. What this means is that every truth claim is always.
What this means is what means. What does he mean there? So he draws a distinction. Some things, like one view says things are mind-dependent. One view says things are mind-independent. What this means is that all truth claims are dependent on. Is he saying independent of whether you're talking about subjectivism or objectivism, all truth claims are dependent on circumstance? Because if he's saying that, then he did not make a mistake, and I made a mistake in my interpretation of him. Or is he clarifying what it means for things to be mind dependent? It's not clear, because that would be the mistake that I thought he was making. That is very frustrating. It's just not clear what he's trying to say here.
Because there's a lot of confusion about this, and I'm sympathetic to confusion on this issue. And I think there's confusion because there's so much rhetorical people, and there's a lot of cultural pressure to push you in a certain direction in your understanding of these things. So I want to make another distinction here before I move on with the critique, all right? And the other distinction...
Okay, so he says, I want to make another distinction. So it's a distinction other than mind-dependent versus mind-independent. So I think I made a mistake here. And then I went on giving him a hard time about making a mistake, and I made the mistake. I think so.
Is, I've already made the point that subjectivism or moral relativism is mind-dependent and objectivism is mind-independent.
Okay, so he already made that point. Now he's going to make another point.
Okay, what this means is that every truth claim is always dependent on the circumstances.
Okay, that's what's confusing about this. So notice what he says here. So he's like, all right, I want to talk about some other distinction, one other than the objectivism, subjectivism distinction. Then he clarifies once again, by objectivism, subjectivism, he means objectivism, mind independent, subjectivism, mind dependent. And then after saying that, he says, what this means. What does he mean by this? What this means is that all moral truths are always dependent on context. What does he mean by this? Does he mean set aside that consideration? There's another consideration orthogonal to those. Independent of whether you endorse subjectivism or subjectivism, truth claims are still dependent on context. Well, one, it's not technically true because you could be an absolutist. You could think that there are exceptionless moral rules as an objectivist or a subjectivist. So there's a difference between making a distinction between different meta-ethical positions and then saying, okay, so I've distinguished objectivism, subjectivism, it's a meta-ethical distinction. And then there's another distinction between whether claims are sensitive to context or not sensitive to context. But instead, he just says they're all sensitive to context. That's just taking a stance. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it'd be like saying, there's a difference between the distinction between, I'm trying to think of two philosophical positions. If I wanted to say there's a difference between substance dualism and some type of monism like physicalism, and then I say, and in addition to that, and then I refer to some other distinction, let's say Platonism or anti-Platonism about mathematics. So imagine I said this. Okay, so substance dualism differs from physicalism, and that substance dualism holds that there's two fundamental kinds of substances, mental substances and physical substances, whereas physicalism is a monistic view that holds that there's only one type of substance, physical substance. Now, it's also true that mathematical objects exist in like a Platonic realm. They have a special ontological status. That's not drawing a distinction. That's just taking a stance on the matter. So that's a confusing thing that he did. And then also when he said this, like, what is this? So very, very confusing. But I think he is trying to convey a different distinction, and that my earlier criticism of him was simply incorrect because I was taking him to conflate subjectivism with contextualism, which it does not appear that he's doing. And in fact, he explicitly at the end of that started saying people sometimes mistakenly think he's doing that. I just mistakenly thought he did that. Now, would I have mistakenly thought that he was doing that if he said, okay, you've got one distinction here, objectivism, subjectivism, which refers to mind independence and mind dependence, but there's a separate distinction. And the other distinction, which is not the distinction between objectivism and subjectivism, is the distinction of whether moral facts are sensitive to context or not. If you'd said that, would I have made that mistake? No, probably not, because then it's very clear what he's saying. What he's saying here was not clear, the transition between describing one of them and the other ones. So my mistake, I recognize I did make an error in interpreting him, but partially due to his lack of clarity.
Mind independent. Okay. What this means is that every truth.
What this means is, so It does not follow from the fact that there's a distinction between objectivism and subjectivism that therefore all moral considerations are sensitive to context. That doesn't follow. So what this means is, and he's not even saying like it follows from, he's saying what this means is. So that almost sounds like some kind of like identity relation, or like he's saying like what the distinction you just made means literally, not that it follows from it, but it means the same thing as. You see the difference? It sounds like he's making some kind of definitional claim or something like that. That's really weird. What a weird way to transition to a different distinction. It's not just unclear. It's almost like engineered to mean the opposite of what he in fact was intending to do. That's really bizarre. So I'm sorry, everybody, for making that mistake. But this is what happens when you review stuff in real time. You make mistakes. But now I'm just fascinated by how and why that mistake occurred. Partially making excuses for myself. But but I don't have, there's not too many excuses to make. It's still a mistake. Mistakes are mistakes when I make them.
Truth claim is all circumstances. Okay. So let me ask you this. Is it true? This is not a trick question, so it's easy to answer. I'm just letting you know in advance. Is it true that Greg Koukl is speaking in front of you right now? Yes. Okay. Will that be true in an hour and a half? No. Why won't that statement be true in an hour and a half? Because the circumstance changes. Truth is when your claim matches the circumstance. When the circumstance changes, then the truth claim has to change with the circumstance. You with me on that? Okay, now this is how it applies to morality, and this is where lots of people get really confused. And this is unfortunate, the way sometimes people have defined objective truth, which they sometimes call absolute truth, and I think that confuses matters, all right? And what they'll say is truth is something that's true for all people at all times and all places. But we just said that it's true that Greg Koukl is speaking right now, but it will not be true at all times. It won't be true in an hour and a half because the circumstances change. You're with me on that so far, right? There's very obvious application, but it has the same application is in play regarding morality. When the circumstances change, sometimes the moral truth regarding those circumstances change. I'll give you a very good example. Is it wrong to punch somebody in the face? Now, why is it different? Why is it in some cases it's okay, any other truth claim? Here's the problem, because the circumstances change. So moral truth is always dependent on the circumstances, just like any other truth claim. Here's the problem. When I teach this and say this, and this is standard ethical thinking. By the way, this is why you have things like moral dilemmas. And why you
so there's some good stuff here. This is standard ethical thinking. This is why you have moral dilemmas, or at least part of the reason.
You have to work through. What's the right thing to do in this circumstance? But when I talk like this, I have been actually called a moral relativist.
So you see what he's doing here. He's making a distinction between sensitivity to context and saying people mistakenly call him a relativist for that. He's absolutely right. People do make this mistake. I've seen it many, many times. They'll think that when you're sensitive to context, that means you're relativist. What I was accusing him of doing was making this mistake, and he was actually trying to explain how it is a mistake. I do think he buried the lead a bit. I do think there would be a better way of presenting this, but I definitely misinterpreted him early on.
There's a kind of a fairly well-known talk show host. I can't remember his name, so I can't diss him for you. I wouldn't anyway. But he said publicly, when is Mr. Koukl going to repent from his relativism? Now, I wrote a book on relativism. I know what relativism is. I got an MA in philosophy of ethics. He doesn't know what relativism is, but this is part of the confusion. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the confusion. So I want to make this clear to you. When the circumstances change, the moral rules that apply to the circumstances change. But here is why that's objectivist. If it is...
So it's not objectivist. It's consistent with objectivism and subjectivism. So subjectivist could say, hey, relative to my standards, it's not okay to punch a person in the face for fun, but it's not okay to punch a person in the face for fun. It is okay to punch a person to stop them from harming a child. It's completely consistent with objectivism, subjectivism. So while he's not making the big error, he is making, I think, quite a few little errors in here.
It's wrong for me to do a certain action in that set of circumstances. It's wrong for everybody in that same.
So that's another mistake. So that has to do with universalism. That has to do with scope. It doesn't have to do with stance independence, which is what objectivism is about. So it's not just wrong for me, it's wrong for everybody. That's not the same thing as whether or not the action is wrong doesn't depend on the stances of individuals. They're just different things. A subjectivist can have this view. Relative to my standards, it's not just wrong for me to hit people in the face. It's wrong for anyone to hit people in the face. But that's true only relative to my standards. So a couple conflations there. He was conflating what mind dependence with universalism, and then whatever the previous, I already forgot.
Set of circumstances.
I'm getting too tired. I'm gonna have to cut this off after about 10 minutes.
Objectivist. If it is wrong for me to do a certain action in that set of circumstances, it's wrong for everybody.
Oh, right. The other one was him saying like that sensitivity to context is like an objectivist view. No, it's not. It's consistent with objectivism, but it isn't exclusive to objectivism. If he meant consistent with objectivism, he should have said that. Not that it is an objectivist view, because that implies that it's not a subjectivist view, and that's not true. And then the other thing here is conflating objectivism with universalism.
In that same set of circumstances. There is an objective state of circumstances that an objective rule applies to. And it doesn't matter who the subject is. The
objective state of circumstances and an objective rule. It almost sounds like you're using different senses of objective. So you don't want to do that. That's confusing.
There is an objective state of circumstances that an objective rule applies to. And
yeah, those seem like different senses of objective. So the first one seems like one that's not having to do with mind independence, and the second one is, or maybe the first one is too. It's not clear.
No matter who the subject is, the same rule applies to them in that circumstance. That's the object.
Yeah, so no matter who the subject is, the same rule applies. There would be some kind of principle, which would be that, like, if all circumstances are identical, the same rule would apply. That it's not true relative to different like stances or individuals, but it's actually technically possible for moral facts to be stance independent, but then not to be applicable to different individuals in virtue of some differences between those individuals. So if you hold everything constant, or all relevant considerations constant, then you can get something that sounds a bit like universalism, but you don't technically get universalism. Because you could have, like, for instance, and this is an example. In fact, I'll just give you the example. I'll show you the example in a second. So that it's not just coming from me and me just coming up with examples. We will share this. Oh, right, I could do this. All right, so check this out. Where did it go? This paragraph here. Second, it's worth stating explicitly that moral anti-realism is not a form of moral relativism, or perhaps more usefully noted, that moral relativism is not a form of anti-realism. Moral relativism is a form of cognitivism, according to which moral claims contain an indexable element, such that the truth of any such claims requires relativization to some individual or group. According to a simple form of relativism, is this where he says cast? Did I get it in the wrong spot? Yeah, no, it's there. Okay. Let me start over. I'll start from here. According to a simple form of relativism, the claim, quote, stealing is morally wrong, might be true when one person utters it and false when someone else utters it. The important thing to note is that this would not necessarily make moral wrongness non-objective. For example, suppose someone were to make the relativistic claim that different moral values, virtues, and duties apply to different groups of people due to, say, their social caste. If this person were asked in virtue of what these relativistic moral facts obtain, there's nothing to prevent them from offering the full-blooded realist answer, quote, it's just the way the universe objectively is. Relativism does not stand opposite objectivism. It stands opposite absolutism. He's using the term here to mean a form of cognitivism according to which the truth of moral claims does not require relativization to any individual or group. One can be both a moral relativist and a moral objectivist, and thus a moral realist. Conversely, one can be both a moral non-objectivist and thus a moral anti-realist. Here he's using, it looks like, the conjunction of moral relativist. He's using the conjunction of relativism and objectivism to mean realism. and non-objectivist and anti-realist to mean both a moral non-objectivist and thus a moral anti-realist and a moral absolutist. Okay, so he's using realism in a way that I don't use the term, but that's fine. We don't use all the terms the same way. But here he is drawing attention to the orthogonality of the distinction between indexicalization and stance dependence. All right, so back to this video. Just to give you an example, like caste system. So, if you have a caste system, then you and another person may be subject to different moral standards, but those moral standards are not made true by minds or stances. So it's still a type of realism.
Objective set. That's not the same as relativism. Relativism is when the circumstances are the same for everybody, but everybody has a different moral opinion about it and they do whatever they want. Again, relativism is subject dependent and objectivism is object dependent. Relativism is mind independent. Objectivism is mind dependent. Okay, with that clarification, now that I've cleared up that confusion, right?
Okay, so he did some good clarifications there. I think he made some mistakes there. Overall, did better than most people do.
It is a tough challenge. Let's talk a little bit about the problems with moral relativism proper. What I'd like to do with the rest of our time together is I want to
This is a good place to stop. So, because he's moving into the new topic, so we'll pick this up again. This is a fun video. Yeah. All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. This is a pretty low-key one today. It wasn't a super lively chat, but that's cool. I'm glad you're all here with me. I'm super tired. I've been getting up really early. At some point, I'll have to explain why. There's some complicated reasons, but I'm shifting my my life schedule around. Probably not a bad thing to do that, to start getting up earlier, because I will have a baby soon, and I am going to have to get used to not having exactly the luxurious sleep schedule that I want. All right, everybody. Sorry for the one little error in there. I'm glad, one, that I caught it in real time, and two, that it wasn't too much trouble to go back, correct for, and modify for it. If Greg sees this or somebody watching this, I do apologize for making that mistake. It's a little embarrassing to make mistakes, but I think it's more important to draw attention to them, apologize for them, and correct for them than it is for me to sit here and bullshit and rationalize about how, no, I didn't really make a mistake. No, I did. I do think it's a little bit your fault, but it's also my fault. But that's one of the the risks that happens when you review something in real time, is that you don't see what's coming ahead, and you have to decide, am I going to comment on this now or not? And you could realize you might have to backtrack. Usually I don't have to do that too much, but fortunately I did spot other errors. So even though that one wasn't a big error, and I do think that vindicates what I had said early on, which is that I think he does quite well relative to a lot of other people on this topic. I think some of the things he clarified were good distinctions to draw, but some of them weren't. So, okay. So yeah, not as bad a video as so many of the ones that I've seen where people are not very nice and they don't really understand the topic very well. Okay, well that's it for now. I'm real tired. It's been a long day. Oof. But I'm hoping to do some more of these. Oh, I have a couple people that should be guests on the channel coming up soon. If you have, by the way, you're always welcome to. Oh, well, actually, some other stuff I'll mention. So do like the video if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Check the links in the description. You'll find all sorts of ways to support me if you want to do that. I've got a Discord community that you could join. I've got a Substack that you could check out, so go check that out. What else do I have? What else do I have to announce? I don't know. I think that's it. I think that's it. Oh, right. What I was going to say. If you have recommendations for videos for me to review or guests I should have on the channel, let me know. I'm probably going to do a few shorter videos this summer just to experiment a little bit. Do a little short video on normative entanglement or something like that. But also, I'm down for doing debates. For a little while, I was reluctant, but I've got I feel like I have like a reservoir of energy, and I could use it for debates, and then it depletes. And then I'm like, I hate debates. I never want to do them again. And then it fills back up, and I'm ready to do one. So I don't think it's that I hate debates or I don't hate debates. It's that I've only got a limited allotment of energy for them, and I haven't used that allotment in a while. So if you have anybody you recommend that I do a debate with, I'd be happy to consider that. All right, everybody. Have a good night. Take care.